I think it's now 5:30 and we can commence our meeting. There were 24 people who tuned in. I'd like to welcome everyone. I would like to thank you for being present. I'm very honored to be able to share the findings of the SEXHUM project with you, with the participants and the panelists, some of whom have also participated in the collection of data and are very important witnesses to help us understand phenomena which are at the very heart of our project. So I'm going to be introducing the project. I'm going to speak generally. I'm not going to be speaking about France because Calogero is going to be talking about this. We'll be talking about the situation with experts, and I'm going to be starting with the PowerPoint that I shall be presenting. So I'm going to share the screen now. Okay, here's my screen share. I'm starting. The SEXHUM project aimed at studying the relationship between migration, sex work and trafficking, and took place in 4 countries which are central in terms of migration policies: Australia, France, New Zealand and the United States. These are very important countries as regards immigration. They're also poles of attraction. And we can see the overall migration flows. At the heart of the project, there's the ambition of putting this at the heart of political elaborations, looking at the experience of migrant sex workers of either sex or all genders and their capacity of agency, and dealing with exploitation based on a coherent, innovative and collaborative methodology. The basic idea of the project is that in research there are somewhat punctual case studies or major sweeping studies which are not consistent. So the challenge to which we decided to rise was to develop a homogeneous methodology on a great scale in 4 countries. Sorry, I just realized that I haven't recorded things. 1 second, please. SEXHUM is an acronym of the idea of sexual humanitarianism. Sexual humanitarianism is a concept which resembles military humanitarianism. If you think of the war in Iraq and the justifications for the intervention was based upon humanitarian logics. This raised a lot of questions. Sexual humanitarianism is a cultural, political and social policy which is analogous because it's a problemizing of certain populations, particularly those vulnerable to exploitation and abuse in relationship to their sexual behavior, which often legitimizes harmful anti-sex works and interventions which damage and make the situation of the concerned populations worse. To understand our methodological approach, we have to realize that we're carrying out long-term ethnographic observations together with qualitative interviewing in all countries, and also with the realizations of films, ethnofiction, And throughout the creation of this film, we used ethnographic observations. I shall be showing what has been carried out in America. These are the countries which are part of the subject. In Australia, we have a country which is one of those countries in which decriminalization has been most effective. In Wales, New South Wales, we have seen that decriminalization, including migrants on short-term visas, we can see that these migrants are allowed to work in the sex industry on short-term visas as it was just a normal, usual labor sector. And we've seen that there are low numbers of trafficking cases because people are given visas. For instance, a student who can work in a shop can also work offering sexual services. We made a comparison between the decriminalization in Sydney, in New South Wales, and in the state of Victoria, where there is regulation. We concentrated on moral panic about supposed exploitation of Asian women, cis-Asian women, authorized to carry out sex work in New South Wales, and unlicensed sex work which took place in Victoria, in the state of Victoria. In Melbourne, for instance. These places are not regulated. We could see that it was claimed that in these places there was no regulation, there was far more exploitation, but we established to the contrary, that where massages were not officially on the menu, we could see that the decision remained with the women who were allowed to make the money, because obviously their bosses were not able to force them to carry out any activities against their will. If we look at New Zealand, this is an example of decriminalization, and if we look at migration, there's the Decriminalization Act of 2003, the Prostitution Reform Act, specifically excludes migrants by Section 19, as only people with permanent residency can work as sex workers. As we've seen in Australia, there are numbers of exploitation of vulnerable migrants. Every time there was an irregularity, we make people more vulnerable. There are employers who would like to profit from this. So the suggestions we make in terms of policy recommendation is that migrant sex workers should also be included in the Prostitution Reform Act of 2003 with its concomitant rights and protection. If we look at the United States, on the other hand, it's a country where the situation is worse when compared with the other countries in our survey, because it is a criminalized environment, i.e. that the purchase and sale of sex is criminalized, with the exception of some counties in Nevada. We found that there was a high number of cases of domestic adults, which means that there's equation of sex work with trafficking. So in policies as well, there is a kind of equation between slavery and trafficking and sex work. We also found evidence of the criminalization of racialized poverty. Most people who are arrested are African American cis women, Asian cis women, so-called Asian cis women because it's a term which has different implications when one moves from one country to another. Asian women were arrested quite frequently, and Latins women were also arrested. So we saw that the white women were not part of that group of people who were targeted. Under the Trump administration, there was an increase, recrudescence of arrests of immigrants to such an extent that in courts in which people tried to defend their cases, including trafficking, we also saw the introduction of SEXHUM FR, which is a law which prohibited internet providers from publishing advertisements for sex workers, thereby forcing them to go to the streets, increasing risks of violence and arrest. So we know the consequences of this. The idea of Floyd has, everything that has followed has shown that people who are arrested undergo racialization in a situation in which the balance of power is very extreme. So there's an increased surveillance, and so there's more incarceration of African American sex workers, but also vast waves of deportation of racialized migrants. The research team that got involved in this project is the following: P.G. Machotti, a PhD candidate in Australia; in France, Calogero Giametta, a PhD candidate with a PhD in France; New Zealand, Callum Benakier; in the United States, 3 people: Henry Fran Maher, Jennifer Mister, and Heidi Hoffinger. The people you heard from New York also participated in this survey. 100% of the interviews gathered were 216 migrant interviews, 15 per country, and between 10 and 20 key informant interviews in each country. There was an extra average COVID-19 interviews gathered in each national setting, so an extra 10 interviews in each country were focused on COVID. We carried out 4 ethno-fiction films. That means that we carried out collaborative projects in groups of migrants in all countries with 4 scenarios, but those films were directed only in New York and Paris, and the other ones are going to be conducted online. There's a non-profit organization of migrant women who are directly involved and interested in this kind of collaborative interaction. This is the beginning of the film we showed in America with intercultural policy, and wanted to take the opportunity to pay tribute to Lourdes Borges, who left us because of the virus on March the 30th, which is a terrible loss for the trans-Latina community in New York and the sex workers movement. Here's the video. The film was just finished, and it will be available. For the time being, we're going to be sending it to festivals in the hope of gaining greater visibility, so that the population which is directly concerned will see it, but we can use excerpts from this film to promote. As regards publications, we've published 2 peer-reviewed articles. We've also produced a special issue of a journal, Social Sciences in Preparation, 1 book chapter, 1 blog article, and there are many other publications in the pipeline. But Calogero is going to be talking about this. We co-published a report with doctors of the world, Médecins du Monde, on the negative impact of the law against the prostitutional system on the lives of sex workers in France. We also tried to have as diverse as possible a sample of people engaged in the sex industry as regards their ethnicity, their area of work, migration, sex, gender, identity, class and race, because we purposefully included racialized and sex-gendered minorities as research participants and also peer researchers, because they are particularly targeted by sexual humanitarian interventions. And they're also most targeted by dynamics of social exclusion, marginalization, and criminalization. This leads us to my main findings. Generally, we've shown that sex work does not coincide with sexual exploitation and trafficking, and is an important livelihood for migrants, particularly those who are without documents. Most of our research participants saw sex work as work. They understand and experience exploitation in the sex industry in terms of labor, i.e. working conditions, rather than the concept of sexual exploitation. We're really talking about labor, working conditions, and unfortunately the humanitarian interventions and humanitarian preoccupations with regard to sex workers in all 4 countries render increasingly repressive and racialized and extreme form of migration policies legitimate in the 4 countries. At the heart of these controls of racialized populations, such we find Asian cis women, but there are also other minorities, migrant groups such as trans Latina women, who are not perceived up in the same way and are not necessarily helped or supported at all because of these categories of humanitarian minorities. There is a proportional relationship with the degree of racialization of migrant groups and their subjection to sexual humanitarian concerns, controls, and bordering. And an important point is that migrant agency and exploitation are embedded in collective experiences. So when we talk about individuals, we met people. If we really want to carry out effective policies to reach out to the populations, we have to deal with communities, because people are not isolated in their existences. As regards policy making, there is an inversely proportionate relationship between the degree of criminalization of sex work and the ability of migrant and non-migrant sex workers to assert their rights and to live their lives. This is the best case study. This is an example to follow. Even if draconian measures are taken against sex work. But as regards policy, we see criminalization, then we've got New Zealand and France. And the worst case is the United States, which is, we can see this inversely proportional relationship illustrated perfectly in this. So the decriminalization of all forms of sex works is obviously a fundamental starting point to counter the social and economic vulnerabilities and violence, abuse and exploitation associated with sex work. However, the decriminalization of sex work should be linked with so decriminalization is not enough. It has to be linked with integration policies supporting people who are excluded from work, housing and society according to their racialized condition, their ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class and migration status. This major debate has already taken place. For instance, there is a substantial difference between white sex workers with documents and the most marginalized strata of the population. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Carlo, and I'll be then available for questions at the end. Yes, thank you very much, Nick, for this introduction. First of all, I would like to thank all of these people who helped us throughout the development of the project. This session project, and other people as well. All of these people who participated during the 3 years of research between Paris and Marseille, but also other countries. SEXHUM France is a survey which took 3 years. We carried out 45 interviews with sex workers, migrant sex workers between Paris and Marseille, which is part of France. We carried 11 interviews with key informers, young people, people working in sex workers associations, or those people who were involved in the overall context of sex work. The sex workers participating in the research were cis and transgender women from Nigeria, China, Eastern Europe, South America and the Maghreb. Methodologically and epistemologically, the project followed an intersectional trajectory. In fact, as sex workers are part of various minority groups, analysis have to focalize effectively on all sorts of structural discrimination such as sexism, racism and transphobia. As Nick said, in SEXHUM we were fortunate enough to be involved in a research project financed by Doctors of the World, Médecins du Monde, which also involved other community non-profit organizations looking at so it was collective work. And this research looked at the impact of the 2016 law criminalizing the purchase of sexual services. This gave us the possibility of establishing a convergence and comparison between ethnographic data and true surveys which were unprecedented in the French context. France has a long history of prohibitionism of sex work since the 1960s. We also decided to focus on the situation of migrants. So France has a long history of prohibiting sex work from the 1960s onwards. Today, the confusion between sex work and trafficking of human beings is very present in mainstream and political discourse, but we find that it goes back to the 1990s, just as in other parts of Europe, with a more visible presence of migrant racialized women sex workers in many European cities. Nonetheless, in the national political space, the need to control sex work emerged a few years later with the law on national security introduced by Nicolas Sarkozy in 2003. With this law, what is referred to as racolage, both passive and active, it refers to soliciting, became a criminal offense. The question of knowing how to deal with the problem of prostitution was submitted to the National Assembly with the 2011 report on sex work presented by two members of Parliament, Daniel Bousquet and Guy Geoffroy, and in this report the two MPs emphasized the right of women and the humanitarian logic of saving sex workers. So from the category of criminals, which had been applied through the criminalizing period of the offense of soliciting, sex workers became considered as victims. So they switched categories. It is important to emphasize the force of the prohibitionist movement here in France. If we look at what's called the collective of abolitionists, who called themselves Abolition 2012, which was the driving force behind the implementation of the law criminalizing the purchase of sex in 2016. The most important movement was called the Nest movement, Le Mouvement du Nid, with its lobbying among politicians, and then the left against the commodification of women's bodies and the fight against the neoliberal economy, which maintained women in a subalternate position under patriarchy. Finally, the delegitimization of the voice of sex workers through the notion of symbolic violence. It's a term which was used quite frequently in a political context, and according to this logic, sex workers cannot understand to what extent they are undergoing violence because of their very status as victims. This is in fact depriving sex workers of all possibility of agency or self-determination. In fact, although it has existed in France since 1975, the sex workers movement was for the most part ignored by political decision makers or disqualified as the pimp's lobby. As Nick anticipated in his introduction, the concept of sexual humanitarianism, which was developed in this project, refers to the world hegemony of a prohibitionist discourse which systematically links prostitution with the trafficking of human beings, presenting sex work as the clearest example of a system of male power. This discourse aims at the abolition of sex works by doing away with the demand for sex services. By concentrating on various groups of migrants, the SEXHUM project was also trying to point out the role of racism and the question of race in discourses and practices against prostitution of migrant populations in particular. To give you a few examples of stereotypes of race and gender which are often mobilized in the context of sex work, Chinese women, with whom a lot was said, We'll hear more about this from Ting Chen, who works in the sex industry, tend to be presented by sexual humanitarian rhetoric as the silent victims of male-dominated Chinese mafias. Nigerian women came to incarnate the ultimate figure of the victim of trafficking, human trafficking, and finally the experiences of violence and abuse undergone by trans Latina women are not really taken into account by sexual humanitarian interventions because they don't correspond to their vision, which is a cis vision, a heterocentrist vision of victimization. So they're outside, they lie outside the category of the good victim relegated to cisgender women. During the project, we noticed that in France, the question of violence to which sex workers are subject is often dealt with as a monolithic object in governmental discussions and among politicians. Finally, we also saw the Covet Crisis. So the question of violence is often dealt with as a monolithical object in government discussions and among politicians. This means that sex workers are submitted to violence precisely because prostitution is, by definition, violence. This equation is in fact problematical because it does not allow us to do away with the insidious character of various ways in which violence can be manifest and the specific social context when women's sex work is criminalized. Many sex workers with whom we spoke in this project don't describe violence in the same way as governmental discourse. Thus, they don't link violence intrinsically to sex work as an activity, but they talk about the violence that they are subject to when they discuss material relations with various actors and institutions, whether we're talking about the police, or whether we're talking about municipal authorities, the repressive legal system, neighbors, husbands and partners, passerbys in the street, the immigration administration, and landlords, intermediaries, and so on. It should be seen that discourse and violence changes depending on the context in which the sex workers can express themselves. So it's necessary to contextualize the various situations in which participants in this research discuss violence, because this is far from a fixed reality. They discuss violence differently at town hall than when they are talking to people from a community non-profit organization or with colleagues. Often, non-profit organizations define violence in their own way, which can orient discourses of sex workers when they are looking for help. We also notice that often sex workers feel responsible for everything that happens to them. For instance, when working in the field, customer violated a participant looking for her apartment, and the sex worker blamed herself because she thought that she had made a mistake when she chose the customer. She said she was angry with herself because she'd always considered herself very selective. Other colleagues who learned about this event also tended to blame her for being imprudent. After the aggression, she thought she had lost her ability to select customers. This type of behavior linked to this criminalizing environment creates divisions among the sex workers themselves because they often have to deal with acts of violence and their consequences on their own. Feeling guilty and judged for the difficult situation that one is going through can create a rift in the solidarity between sex workers and illustrates the fact that if this form of violence is not identified and discussed as a social product, for instance through the stigmatization of sex work, those people who are submitted to this violence can easily have psychological consequences and feel responsible for the violence. For the sex workers who started the sex work more recently, it seems that it was an even more severe problem because they don't know the strategies that more experimented sex workers have to protect themselves. Nevertheless, solidarity doesn't disappear that easily. It's reorganized in different ways. To oppose the present-day policies on sex works and the aggravated situation experienced by migrant sex workers in France, increasingly we've seen that experimented sex workers have started to link together with younger sex workers by working together. We saw this in the case of Chinese sex workers, for instance. And often the more experienced and more aged sex workers share their knowledge, and the younger ones share their customers. Before sex works had become such a precarious activity, which has been exacerbated by this prohibitionist legislative framework, what could be described as a solidarity of care in which the sex workers supported less experienced sex workers when they needed it, seems today to become an economic agreement in which women get together with a single aim, which is that of financial subsistence. This can be considered a form of solidarity since two parties decide to try and find a solution for their financial precarity, personal security, and so as to improve the working conditions. In this sense, sex works enter into a relationship defined by a specific division of labor. At any rate, this transformation of practices of solidarity involves risk-taking vis-à-vis the authorities, because this thereby becomes a criminal offence of pimping according to French law. Because if two women or more work together in an apartment, the person who signed the lease can be accused of pimping. Political decision makers and public commentators do not take account of the desires and personal projects of sex workers and migrant sex workers in particular. It's often rejected that sex work as an activity, as work, as a form of socialization makes sense for those who are engaged in it. A number of migrant sex workers feel that what they're doing makes sense, although it may be a fragile equilibrium because of the stigmatization that society associates with what they're doing. So it's easier for society as a whole to regard sex workers as incapable of taking care of their own life by taking autonomous decisions, and it's far more simple to perceive of them as the silent victims of patriarchal social relations and capitalism. This is why this social script often hides the complexity and multiplicity of life trajectories of sex workers. Towards the end of the SEXHUM project with the Covet Crisis, we saw once again that people who are already living in a precarious situation because of their sex work have to pay the highest price. Dinah de Riquet-Bons is going to be talking afterwards about the impact of COVID-19 on the sex workers community in France, because she's carried out interviews throughout the territory. Here I wanted to emphasize that because of police activities, we've seen that in France, during and after lockdown, lots of sex workers ended up paying fines for not having respected the lockdown measures, which has made them work harder and risk their own health. Non-profit organizations working with sex workers in France required an emergency fund to support their community during the lockdown, but it was refused by the government despite the fact that 5 million euros per annum were voted for programs to get people out of prostitution. So the results of the SEXHUM project suggest that sex work should be completely decriminalized. which in the French context means abrogating the criminalization of customers and laws on the basis used by third parties and the sex workers themselves. The 2016 law, which sanctions customers of sex workers in France, has shown that neoliberal policies which were implemented to fight against trade in sex paid more importance than necessary to criminal justice, and the control of a number of migrants is at the very heart of the process of creating greater security for France. The so-called refugee crisis and terrorist attacks from the year 2015 in Belgium, and the state of emergency that followed for 2 years, the anti-terrorist measures which were implemented in 2017 under Macron, the police context throughout the COVID-19 crisis, all of this has triggered an increase in police raids and identity crisis which targets non-white migrant women, LGBT, cis and transgender women living in these cities in France. And I think I've finished here. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Calo, for this presentation, for presenting your main findings for the research. I would now like to turn the floor over to Ting Chen, who is a psychosociologist. Good evening, can you hear me? Thank you very much, Nicolas and Calogero, for offering this framework for research so we can centralize our reflection and share our ideas. I'd also like to thank you for giving us the floor so that we can listen to those people who are concerned, particularly in this very troubling context. We have to create a forum so we can discuss things and reflect together so as to enter into dialogue between academic people working in the field and those who are concerned. Calogero, when he was saying that if we don't organize our discussions in this way, symbolic and social violence can be internalized by people. Instead of saying that this is social violence, why do precarious people aggress other precarious people? When sex workers aggress one another, they think it's their own fault. I'm at fault. I'm the person who wasn't sufficiently attentive. It's everywhere. Aggression is growing. Violence is growing, and other people are suffering the same thing. It's not their fault. It's important, I think, above all, to emphasize that. So I'm going to report some words for Zacier. The non-profit organization was founded in autumn 2014 by Chinese sex workers with the support of other groups such as Médecins du Monde, Doctors of the World, and Stras, which is the sex workers trade union. The objective being simple: to collectively defend rights vis-a-vis violence linked to our work, and on the other hand, the police state discrimination with the social prejudices. It seems to me that there are three dimensions to our activity. One which is more political and more social, which is to create a greater understanding for the conditions in which people work, specifically Chinese sex workers. Think about ties to other non-profit organizations. Secondly, there's more local work in the districts in which we live and work. So we have to raise awareness as a people who live in the area, and people who have local trades, local shops, so as to create bonds, ties, to create mutual understanding. And finally, activities between ourselves, self-defense, to fight against violence, people who are travelers, and create spaces, for instance, for breakfast, where women can come and talk on a daily basis. These are the kind of safe spaces that we're trying to create. And with Hélène de Riquet, at the Institut d'études politiques, the Institute of Political Science, we're going to be publishing something in immigration, men and migration. We would like to show how politically and locally and in the present context of hardship, creating the situation doesn't make it easier to create bonds. What we need to do is create these bonds, but we run up against walls. I'd like people to better understand who these women are, and in our non-profit organizations we have roughly 140 Chinese women, the average age of which is roughly 50 years. The Bureau consists of 7 sex workers who are 58 years of age by average. This is from a Chinese newspaper, and this is the bookkeeping of the Racialized non-profit organization, which shows all of the meetings, and everything has been accounted for. The purchase of a bottle of orange juice, for instance, just to show you to what extent the migrants with their resources try and work together, and how difficult it's been. People don't know what a provisional project is or a provisional budget, but the women have the desire to work together so as to improve their living and working conditions. We sometimes have the impression that we're living in parallel universes with completely opposed realities. It's a vision of politicians who think that for sex workers, for us, it's an industry, it's prison. There are very clear entries and exits, but for a 55-year-old woman who's living in France, who is trying to pay her rent or help their families or pay for their son's rent in China, sex workers have a much more informal approach. I had friends, I came to France, I decided to try to muddle through, I got involved in sex work, and there's an event, my son is going to get married in China, I'd like to go back, I'm trying to get out. So there are forms, very informal forms of moving in and moving out of sex work, as opposed to the ideas of politicians. So today we can see this difficulty related to COVID. Women are capable of choosing how they will deal with lockdown. Is it safer to stay home on their own, or should they get together with their women friends? Sometimes they have a project of family, or sometimes a project of work, and so they're combinations which women may decide are pertinent or relevant for themselves as sex workers. But it's absurd to suggest that these women have no control or agency in their lives. I wanted to emphasize this. They're women with complex situations which merit more subtle and more discerning understanding. Thank you very much. I think it's very important to contextualize the concepts and discourse surrounding sex works and regarding the reality of those people who are immediately concerned, so as to better understand the simplifications and to establish whether policies are effective. or do they not, to the contrary, endanger the people who are most immediately concerned? The next speaker is Dinah de Riquet-Bons, who is an LGBTQI plus trans lobbyist for HIV and sex work, and a member of the PVDA Labour Party. At the age of 20, she started as an activist as the Latina Black group, and she's now part of the bicultural organization. She's also in the Board of Governors and an operational member of ICRC and NWP. And she influences transgender policies for the European Union in policies, and she's part of a transgender European political policy making committees. Thank you very much, Dinah de Riquet-Bons, for being with us. Is that right? Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. It's a very special opportunity for me to be here today, because you've been working on your project for more than 3 years. I was on the project in the most recent months, and so I'm just a very small part of this overall project, and I was asked to conduct an interview following the lockdown as soon as it was possible to travel again to Amsterdam. When all the borders were open, I came back to Paris. I saw how sex workers worked. It was my sabbatical. You gave a very good summary of my curriculum vitae. I'm still here. I came back to Amsterdam for my studies, but after this period of lockdown, I came back to Paris, and with all of the people I knew there, I felt a kind of depression. And during the interviews, I also found various ways to resolve problems, coping mechanisms, because I tried to find a great diversity of people, men, women, transgender, and non-binary genders. It's very important to me to find people of all origins, French racialized, migrant racialized, French people, because these interviews offer us a palette of people affected by COVID, and notably sex workers. We know what regularization meant. You had to have certification documents you had to fill out, and in certain interviews I found that people found it very difficult to fill out these interviews. It led to a great deal of stress. They perceived of this as a kind of policing. For instance, having to write down that you were black or Latina, being racialized, it was acquainted with police profiling, racial profiling, together with having to submit documents such as a passport and a visa, was very frightening for a number of people. In the 10 interviews, I found that there was a lot of support from organizations such as Giovanna's organization, So these were non-profit organizations which provided a lot of assistance, not just financial but also technical assistance in filling out forms and explaining the law and the implications of the law, but sometimes it created a great deal of stress, and since people were living with a lot of people in a building, this also exacerbated the stress. It was a situation after the lockdown which is still present and has created a lot of damage. When working in committees, we established that violence following the lockdown, it became very, very palpable, very tangible, that there was a kind of a post-war period What I found really interesting was that racism was above all a catalyst of all other things. And I saw this in the movement of which I'm a part of, this anti-racist movement with Black Lives Matter. We really saw that the police, which is an European institution which has institutionalized racism, has a great deal to do with power mechanisms. The police had more power in the streets. They really carried out racial profiling, looked for racialized people whom they were far more likely to ask documents from. There was also a great deal more police violence and institutional violence. So it was very interesting to see how people of color had to contend with these practices. Another thing that I found very interesting was the situation of LGBT persons, for instance. There were boys who'd been profiled, their gay profile was used to allow them to be in more immediate exchange with the policeman. I found this very surprising in Marais. Often gayness is something that is traditionally be hidden. So I found it remarkable that it was being profiled in the institutions. And I discovered in various interviews that it was a way to relate to the police. What I also found very interesting was that people who were throughout the field and throughout the various societies, for people who are undergoing economic hardship, who don't have housing or don't have the opportunity to adapt to the institution, they've found the flexibility in the sex workers community quite remarkable. There's a great deal of mutual assistance, attempts to do things so as to guarantee security for one another, because a lot of us were unable to work in lockdown with customers, but more generally we saw forms of behavior which were quite remarkable. I think this is what I can contribute to this discussion. Thank you very much, Dinah, for your intervention. I think it was very touching to spend time with you, to accompany you in your path, and I think that what you're saying has given us some hope, at the same time provoked a bit of despair, because it's clear that the non-profit organizations that represent sex workers have the capacity to help people, but they don't have the economic means to do so, to help people. This has to change, because the population which is directly concerned can describe their problems in all their complexity, and non-profit organizations on their own would not be able to do this. So thank you very much for bearing witness to this group. Now we're going to listen to Giovanna Rincon. It's our honor to welcome you today. Giovanna is an activist for trans persons in France, the director of a non-profit organization, as vice president in the Committee Against HIV, and a member of the piloting committee. Giovanna, I give you the floor. We cannot hear you. We're going to wait for Giovanna to reconnect, and I hope that it will work better. There's a problem, so we're going to allow Niall to rest, because he said that he needs 5 minutes after an hour of work. So it's normal for him, because simultaneous translation is very tiring indeed. Can you hear me now? Yes, we hear you. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. Great work you're doing very quickly. Our non-profit organization was created by trans women, sex workers, migrants, and decided to set up projects for their group. This non-profit organization has been certified by the local health authorities and offers all sorts of measures to carry out activities to support trans women. So it's a strategic place in Château Rouge in the 8th arrondissement. We are also involved in formulating the strategy for public health, and we're participating in diagnosis of HIV in accompanying people, so as to find care, health care, working together with various hospitals. And we have two orientations. One is to accompany people who have just been diagnosed as HIV positive, and also help people who are HIV negative get prophylactics PrEP. I think I'm probably speaking a bit too fast for the person who's doing the translation. I think I'm going to concentrate what I have to say on certain parallels between what has just been said previously by my comrades, notably what is related to criminal offences, the criminal offence of pimping or procurement, where obviously the situation of human trafficking exists, but is not systemic in all groups, notably in trans. The issue of trafficking in trans people has been little documented or inexistent. So what exists is what we know. Some people can become exploited, but it cannot be compared with slavery or trafficking. Why are we seeing a crisis? Because with the crisis of COVID, we've been confronted more than ever with the need to reinforce our strategies of mutual assistance, bring all of our capacities, forces together to marshal all of our strengths to work on the basis of 10 years of experience to ensure that what can be considered a criminal offense of solidarity no longer be associated with the criminal offense of pimping or procuring, particularly in the light of the COVID crisis. Why am I saying this? Because in effect, when working with APTC, we saw that protocols which were accepted by the Ministry of Health and the government have nothing to do with what we have elaborated as solutions. So the recommendations we were given was to close shop and no longer receive customers, whereas our response was the opposite. It was to say proactive lockdown adapted to sex work, because we realized at any rate sex work was not going to stop systematically, and we should not lie to ourselves, and we should create a strategy which could truly contribute to the reduction of contaminations. So we adopted strategies for the reduction, the lifting of the lockdown. This strategy, which from the beginning of the lockdown had been set up on the basis of material needs, giving people food to eat, measures of prevention kits against COVID, thermometers, and masks and alcohol gel for washing the hands. All of these measures were taken, but what we also set up was a way to respond to the situation of emergency of housing faced by a large number of people in sex work. Not just that, because all of the strategy of COVID which we developed in March meant that we're receiving an increasing number of trans people who were followed by abolitionists, non-profit organizations and other partners. They found themselves incapable of finding a systemic solution for problem of housing. So an emergency fund had to be created of 200,000 euros. These 200,000 euros also, we should remind you that these 200,000 euros came from public funds from the city of Paris, Santé France, a laboratory, and also the DL, which gave us 30,000 euros in service checks for the months of July and August. Now, this response was not limited to finding means from solidarity within the community, but also reminded the state of its responsibility, not necessarily to guarantee places of prostitution, but to guarantee that people had a place where they could be safe during lockdown, a place which would allow them to be protected and protect other people. Since that they were no longer able to earn their living to pay for a place to stay. This was an appeal that we made, which allowed us to receive funds from a number of institutions. We're running out of money because the money which allowed us to act was only 100,000 euros, which was attributed to rehouse somewhat more than 30 trans women who were in sex work over 50, 60 or 70 years of age, who lived in France and had never had the possibility to have regular papers in France. What we managed to do was not only help them to find housing, but also help them to eat, not only during the lockdown, because we're continuing to pay for their hotel accommodation now. What we now understand with this response is that we can see a parallel between the fight against AIDS and the fight against COVID. Now, why? Because contrary to the fight against AIDS, sex work remained an option and a socioeconomic space for the most discriminated people, notably trans women, as a possibility of socioeconomic resistance. But as soon as the COVID epidemic reared its ugly head, the possibility was completely cut off. It became inexistent, or indeed very dangerous, far more dangerous than AIDS or HIV. The issue of stigmatization also plays a role, because being HIV positive in the year 2020, where people are able to live with HIV better and better because medication is more effective. But on the other hand, what we can also see is the fear of knowing that one has been in contact with COVID, that one was sick and one could transmit this. And so we have to work on this basis, because the families of such people also have to deal with this. So the material, the necessity of these people doesn't consist only giving them a roof over their head and something to eat. They also have a project, they also have plans for the future. And the trans undocumented people who have no possibility of getting any social assistance in France, apart from medical help, should be able to get preventive prophylactics, which are now being made available for people who are most likely to be contaminated. So it's the health ministry which is, on the other hand, offering a tool designed for sex workers, and on the other hand, given the legislative schizophrenia, wants people to stop carrying out sex work. So the reality is that these people are the most closely affected by precarity with regard to the COVID epidemics. So in reality, what is of the greatest concern to us, as you said earlier, the question that was raised earlier as regards the health crisis, we realized in the course of time that borders were being controlled, but we see this reality We saw this reality from the 12th of May onwards, after lockdown was suspended. So not only do we have undocumented women who were not contaminated with HIV and never got papers, because the only option they had was to become HIV positive so as to benefit from this. This reality, as I was saying, at the time lockdown was lifted, we no longer hear. We're waiting for 30 days so that we can develop a real appeal for the government. The people we're dealing with are the Home Ministry, the Ministry of Interior, which are continuing not only to apply measures to trans women who have been living here for 30 years. So we're asking ourselves, what's happened to the law which was promulgated in 2016 to give them assistance? How can we avoid these people getting AIDS contamination? Even HIV positive sex workers in France continue to be threatened by the prospects of expulsion, of deportation. So if we look at the opportunities, the possibility we have of dealing with these epidemics such as COVID, we've appropriated virtuality, and this virtuality has become linked to a kind of civility. What we're doing is aimed at producing a result with a COVID strategy between March and now, so as to trace back all of the work to establish public policies, but also to make this available for our work so as to continue to cross and elaborate a true strategy, because in reality, for the first time, our knowledge is being recognized, because given the COVID epidemic, all the abolitionist non-profit organizations of the major structures that deal with AIDS are being overwhelmed, and our strategy has shown that we can be an example in community prevention strategies and sharing knowledge. It's a real recognized strategy, recognized by the government and public authorities. So your work will be of enormous support. The data are highly useful. So I think that we have very good elements for once and for all, reminding people that criminalization has to be looked at as a subject which is an emergency, because given the COVID epidemic, the only solution which exists to work against trafficking and the criminalization that not only contributes to the precarity but also excludes people, particularly the issues of invisibility in all of the struggles, feminism and the like. Obviously, I think that from now on, the question that is most urgent for us in our non-profit organization is to call for the regularization, the systematic regularization of all trans people on our territory, and particularly trans people who have been living here for more than 20 years. And we would also like to hope that regularization is not only a stake which will be looked at as from the perspective of repression, because new generations have no choice but to immigrate. This makes us think that the reality of repressive policies, even in certain countries with the extreme right wing, doesn't take account of LGBT populations and sex workers, that the fascist policies, for instance, we've seen in Brazil with the enormous impact of COVID, the poverty which has created COVID is not a local, it's not a French issue, it's a global issue and has to be responded to with a systemic approach. We have to make people understand that sex workers are in danger, and they're in danger in their own country. This is a kind of appeal, and I would like you to wish you every possible success in your work, and I'd like to thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this intervention, which was very interesting. I think really you really drew the conclusions from the previous speakers. We brought together a lot of subjects, and you added another level to our reflection. Often people only respond in situations of urgency, in emergencies. And I think we really have to validate the knowledge that you share so as to make progress. I think it's a time to continue our exchange, to share our findings, our data, so as to continue this conversation. And as academics, I think we need this kind of reflection. So thank you very warmly. I've learned a great deal. Now we only have a few minutes. I think Niall is going to kill me after this session because he's asked for a break. We now only have 5 minutes. If anyone has any questions or for the speakers, for the members of the panel, please write them in the chat. I don't see any questions myself. Or if you have any things that you'd like to say to one another, do feel free to do so. Ellen Lebai says thank you. I can't see any questions. Calo, have you got questions? We're waiting for questions. I wanted to thank Giovanna, Dina, and Ting. You're great. It's great that you were able to help us and to accompany our project. You've opened all sorts of doors for us, and thank you very much for your trust. You've helped us a lot with our questions. It's great that we were able to work together, and Giovanna, thank you very much for making it clear how drastic the problems of expulsion and deportation have become, and also for highlighting the gap between the prevention measures and the reality of the precarity of the situation of the populations we've been dealing with. I don't see any questions. I have a question. There's an anonymous spectator. There's been a question of creating refugees accommodation for trans or sex workers. I can't answer that question. Giovanna's microphone is not on. This answer is systematic. You can understand that we've already set up housing for the most vulnerable and destitute transes. Our strategy is recognized and is also become implemented in public policy, how can we make this a permanent arrangement while avoiding romanticization, because there's public funds which are going to allow us to house the most vulnerable. The question is not whether we should create housing for this population, but how can we resolve the problem of legislation, of stigmatization, of the health conditions for all people who are not responsible for this. The question is also, how can we ensure that we don't turn into service providers for the state in the management of sex workers? The question is how we, with our projects, can inscribe our action in creating a respectful and an intelligent legislation which will be capable of recognizing the agency of people, which will allow people to distinguish between real trafficking in human beings and the recognition of public spaces for trans sex workers. I think it's important that there be a place to house people, but we also, above all, have to develop a critical vantage for all of these issues. Thank you very much, Giovanna. Dina, would you like to answer something? No. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Giovanna, for your very interesting words. It's very important to place these political questions in the framework of autonomy. I would have liked to have addressed this question more so. It's very good to talk about decriminalization. We also have to fight against these structural exclusion, lack of access to public health and so on. I'd just like to finish to say that this work was possible. There are two tasks. One is legislative, which is perhaps the most ambitious, but I think that after everything that has been said, the other hand, there's local public policy. There we have to do a great deal of work, because in the two fields there's what we now call a radical feminism, aimed at abolition. And today, with what we have achieved in Paris for the first time, the city of Paris has attributed 45,000 euros because they've recognized the ability we have for housing and dealing with this COVID. This kind of recognition through the allocation of this funding is a starting point which will allow us to work together systematically at this very critical point in time. So I think that our discussion, our ideological discussion, is starting to crystallize, and I'm convinced we'd already elaborated with the city of Paris and Anne Hidalgo. We'd set up a dialogue. We brought up the consequences of criminalization on the health, not only for sex workers, but as regards the health of our customers. And I would like to close this parenthesis because we mustn't assume that customers are necessarily aggressors, rapists, or killers. We have to remember that people who are customers, pretend to be customers, are in reality killers and rapists. That's another thing, which is why I'm appealing to people's idea of responsibility. The health services of the city of Paris are supposed to be looking at the health of everyone, of transsexuals, prevention for everyone, and we mustn't pollute this debate through an ideological prejudice. We're obviously very emotionally involved in the debate on prostitution, but this has to be made far more rational. The debate on prostitution has to be made far more rational, and COVID has shown that we have been able to get some public funding so as to respond to the needs created through this pandemic. So then I hope that this is just the beginning. It's true that symbolically and politically it's a first step. And I would hope that this recognition is just only a beginning. A great vote of thanks to all of the speakers, and if there are no other questions, I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone. We've recorded all of this, which will be made available to those people who are unable to listen to it and to accompany us today. So it's the combination of collaboration which is going to be even deeper in the future. There are going to be publications, or there are going to be recommendations for politicians. I've learned a great deal. I'd like to thank you once again very warmly. Look forward to seeing you. Thank you for all of these people who participated. See you soon. Kisses to everyone. Thank you. Bye.